Well, the liberal influencer and Democratic candidate for Congress, Kat Abughazaleh, was indicted for impeding a federal officer. And man, this story, I think, warrants a detailed breakdown. I think it tells us something about the moment that we're living in. So I'm going to get to that in just one moment. Before I do, remember, subscribe over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show, including the full premium version of this very episode where I'm going to go into even greater depth. Make sure also to subscribe on YouTube and on your podcast apps. All right, let's start here with Kat Abughazaleh reacting to the federal indictment against her.
My name is Kat Abughazaleh. I'm running for Congress in the 9th District of Illinois, and the Department of Justice is charging 6 people, including myself, with federal crimes for exercising our First Amendment rights near ICE's Broadview Processing Center. This is a political prosecution and a gross attempt to silence dissent, a right protected under the First Amendment. This case is a major push by the Trump administration to criminalize protest and punish anyone who speaks out against them.
All right, now let's take a look at the original video that shows the scene where Abughazaleh has since been charged with impeding the federal officer. Okay, now I'm going to read a little bit of the New York Times coverage just so you have all of the who, what, when, where, why details here. A federal grand jury in Chicago indicted 6 people, including a Democratic congressional candidate, that's Abughazaleh, and other local politicians on charges of interfering with a federal agent during a chaotic protest outside an immigration detention site last month, so that's September. Some Illinois Democrats accused the Justice Department of singling out President Trump's political opponents for prosecution with the indictment, which was unsealed on Wednesday. The top federal prosecutor in Chicago defended the charges as upholding the rule of law. The charges unsealed on Wednesday, the Times goes on to say, related to a September 26 protest outside an immigration and customs enforcement facility in the suburb of Broadview, Illinois. Demonstrators have gathered repeatedly at the Broadview site, sometimes blocking access to the driveway and engaging in physical confrontations with federal agents. Those agents have at times used tear gas, pepper balls, and physical force against protesters. So the charging document, a little bit more from the Times here, asserts that the defendants were part of a larger group that tried to block a federal agent from driving to the ICE facility that morning. So the allegation here is that's what you're seeing in the video. And I'll just say that's pretty clearly what you're seeing in the video. That's pretty clearly what the protesters say they're doing. They will argue that this is civil disobedience, preventing ICE from doing its tasks, which they object to. So it goes on to say the indictment said members of the group banged on the vehicle, stood in front of it, pushed against and damaged a side mirror and windshield wiper. Someone in the group etched the word pig into the vehicle. The charging documents said all 6 defendants were charged with interfering with a federal agent and conspiring with one another to interfere with an agent. Both charges can carry multi-year prison sentences, the Times notes. Now, this is pretty interesting. Abughazaleh went on Tara Palmieri's show to talk a little bit about her reaction to these charges. Palmieri asked her if she etched pig onto the vehicle, and Abughazaleh, who eventually leaves the interview because she says she can't, she's frustrated, she says she can't talk about this case. She says she's, whatever the charges are, she's pleading not guilty to the charges. She's that confident that she's not guilty of any of the charges, that she's not answering questions. So in response to the question about who etched pig, did she etch pig? Abughazaleh says she's just not answering questions about the case. Fair enough. No evidence that I can see that she is the one who did it as of yet. But either way, there's evidence pretty clearly of her impeding a federal officer. So I then asked, because I've been looking into this case a bit, looking into the charges, I asked Will Chamberlain, who's a conservative attorney, very Trump-aligned attorney at the Article 3 Project, and he's been on the show before. Will said, I asked about this public sidewalk, right? Because people are claiming that it was on a public sidewalk, so actually the ICE officer who was driving near the sidewalk is in the wrong. Will says, you don't have a right to stand in a crosswalk and stop cars from crossing. You don't have the right to physically impede government vehicles and bang on their hoods just because you are in a crosswalk. A crosswalk is a place where you are allowed to cross when you have the right of way. She conspired with the people in that video to physically obstruct and trespass onto a vehicle. Now, I read The Intercept's very sympathetic coverage of Kat Abughazaleh just to get, the side of the left on these charges. This is from Natasha Leonard, who writes, let's be clear, if 6 people nonviolently protesting outside a government facility constitutes a criminal conspiracy, all First Amendment protected activity is at risk. That's a very interesting claim because, first of all, Leonard focuses almost exclusively on the conspiracy charge and not the charge of impeding a federal officer. Remember, this is from the New York Times. All 6 defendants were charged with interfering with a federal agent. And then the second charge was conspiring with one another to interfere with an agent. Let's just pause for a moment and say, why are we talking about Kat Abughazaleh? Well, she has a massive social media following, and that's kind of how she ended up running for Congress. Kat Abughazaleh is someone who made her career at Media Matters, Mother Jones, kind of left-wing media companies and news outlets, breaking down, she used to say in her Twitter bio something to the effect of, I watch Tucker Carlson, so you don't have to. And this is really her claim to fame. She went to George Washington University, which happens to be my alma mater, comes from a pretty well-off family, high school in Arizona, then went to GW, tried to work in politics right afterwards, and moved to Chicago pretty recently because her boyfriend is Ben Collins, who for a while was like the disinformation reporter at NBC News, who, in my opinion, did some really utterly disgraceful journalism, where as a journalist, he was cheering on the censorship and suppression of other journalists, which is something that people at Media Matters do. It's hard to adopt the journalist label for those at Media Matters who are calling constantly for calling constantly for the suppression of conservative voices that they don't like. And in this case, Abughazaleh was doing that for years and years and built up a massive following. And she is running in this primary to replace Schakowsky in a Chicago district. Again, she's only lived in Chicago for a little while. So there's, I've already seen on social media allegations of carpetbagging. I'm sure that's something she has to deal with in her campaign. But all this to say, when you have a massive social media platform and you're clever about it, sometimes you can parlay that into really big fundraising advantages. And so Abughazaleh is not, a total long shot for this congressional seat, especially because most Democrats right now, as we've covered on the show, desperately want to see politicians, lawmakers, candidates standing up to the Trump administration and the Democratic establishment. So if you can look like you have a stiffer spine than Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, you are already getting a leg up. Most Democratic voters, the types of people who go out in a primary, do not want to see what ICE, for example, has done according to the media, right? Even Joe Rogan is a good example. Even Joe Rogan has said some of this seems harsh. Other people have said the same, like from that podcast universe. And so all that is to say, the question of mass deportation still polls pretty well. But some of these images, it's not a disadvantage by any means for a Democratic candidate for Congress to look like they're standing up against ICE overreach. And so I'm not saying that this was politically calculated by Abughazaleh. I'm sure she believes exactly that. She should be impeding, interfering with the duties of ICE officers. This is what the protesters are saying that they're doing. They're saying they're intentionally trying to block ICE, to interfere with ICE, to stop ICE from doing what it's doing because they believe that is right. They believe that is the virtuous cause. Well, it happens in this case that blocking a federal vehicle does look like it is illegal. And so Abughazaleh, if you've noticed in her video, is making this about free speech. Natasha Leonard in the Intercept piece is making this about free speech, although she was claiming that in the case of the conspiracy charges narrowly. But if you interfere, very obviously, physically put your body on a federal vehicle, especially as the federal vehicle is in the course of its duty, it is trying to go into the ICE facility, that's a crime. That's illegal. That is against the law. And it's also sort of the point of the protest. So two things can't necessarily, it can't be that she was doing this protest to block ICE and that blocking ICE is totally fine if you're putting your physical body in the way of an ICE officer doing their job. So that's already I think, significant contradiction. And I think it might, not hurt Abughazaleh in a Democratic primary. I'm just saying that she has massive influence and is claiming that this is a free speech. I actually think there are some real threats to free speech that are bouncing around. Some of them are coming from the right, too. I think a lot of them are coming from the left. Some of them are coming from the right, too. So I think to weaponize this as a free speech question is really pathetic. This is not about free speech. The argument, if there's an over-prosecution about whether this is a question of free speech, you could have a different discussion about that. But this is not a free speech case. This is her physically putting her body on an ICE car and impeding with the ICE officer doing their duty. And I thought to myself, as I was reading through this case, that's interesting. The Biden administration infuriated the pro-life movement for prosecutions over what is called the FACE Act. Have you ever heard of the FACE Act? I'm about to get into this in a little more detail for premium subscribers, but Will Chamberlain also pointed something out here. Kat Abughazaleh, who cheered on the prosecution of a man for allegedly obstructing access to an abortion clinic, has now been federally indicted for obstructing a law enforcement officer in the performance of his duty. So I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but all this is to say, basically, FACE Act prosecutions, it imposes, as a Clinton era, criminal penalties on individuals convicted of, quote, violent, threatening, damaging, and obstructive content that interferes with access to abortion clinics, places of worship, and pregnancy centers. So that is from the Catholic News Agency. That's pretty much exactly what the FACE Act does. So you can be you could be praying, blocking the entrance to an abortion clinic, and you will be sort of like blocking an ICE vehicle from getting into the Broadview ICE facility, and then you'd be prosecuted. And the Biden administration did that multiple times, and Kat Abughazaleh here appeared to have been cheering it on. So it's one of those many examples of free speech proponents finding themselves really in favor of free speech when they're the ones, as they see it, being targeted. Free speech is like the most, of course, it brings out the most inconsistent principles in both sides. But this is not, this is not a free speech case. I actually have a different take on the FACE Act stuff and why I think it is a free speech case. And I'm going to get to that in just one moment. But just wanted to break down this indictment because it's already going massively viral. Abughazaleh is going to raise tons of money off of it. She left the Tara Palmieri interview. She's a congressional candidate. Left the Tara Palmieri interview early, because she didn't want to answer questions about this, and is drawing sympathy for actions that, you can think they might not be prosecuted. You can think don't prosecute them, but it's not an insane prosecution, and it is not an anti-free speech prosecution to say she interfered with federal officers. So for the rest of this, I am going to break down, I think, even further what the comparisons are with the left's cheering on for prosecutions of pro-life activists who blocked access to abortion clinics in a similar way, but a slightly different way. There's some really interesting stuff going on with this. So stick around, subscribe to undercurrents.tv to see the rest of the video, subscribe on YouTube, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and I'll be back with more soon, or I'll see you behind the paywall.